Welcome to this virtual seminar organized by the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. I am the current president of the society. My name is Thijs Bork, and I'm very happy to welcome you here. These virtual seminars are intended to showcase the rich diversity of the cool research that we're doing within our field, ranging from archaeological insights of the Staffordshire Hoard to the use of Neo-Old English in modern TV series. And today we're going to look at source study. In particular, we're going to look at Ælfric and his use of Gregory and swallowing dragons. Now, today's seminar is co-organized with the research project Sources of Old English and Anglo-Latin Literary Culture. Originally, we had planned for Brandon Hawke, the director of the project, to give a little introduction to the project. But unfortunately, he had to make some last-minute changes to his schedule. So instead, I'll try to sing the project's praises before we move on to the main show of the virtual seminar, which is the lecture by Claudia Di Sciacca. But first, let me tell you that you should all go to the website of the project, which is on this slide here. If you're interested in knowing what kind of sources and manuscripts were available in England between 500 and 1100 CE. What works did people like Bede and Ælfric and Oldham have access to? What kind of manuscripts were circulating around that time? You will find it all, or at least part of it, because it's a work in progress since 1983 on this website. It's a very informative website, which also features a number of published entries. Entries are published both online and in print, and you can find appropriate links and information on the project's website. They're always looking for new people to contribute entries, so do again go to this website and find out more. Now, to show you how fascinating this sort of research can be into the sources that Old English authors were using, we have a lecture by Claudia Di Sciacca. We're very happy that she's here, we're very honored that she's willing to give the paper. Professor Claudia Di Sciacca teaches Germanic philology and linguistics at the University of Udine in Italy. Her research and publications chiefly focus on Old English homiletic and hagiographical prose and its Quellenforschung, which is German for source study. She's also dealt with the aspect of Germanic lexicology, glossography, glosses, and language contact. She's the author of the book Finding the Right Words, Isidore's Synonyma in Anglo-Saxon England, and the editor of various volumes, including this one on rethinking and recontextualizing glosses, new perspectives in the study of late Anglo-Saxon glossography. She's also a member of the editorial board of SUALC, Sources of Old English and Anglo-Latin Literary Culture. And today she's going to talk about how Ælfric of Eynsham used a particular source about swallowing dragons, or rather dragons that swallow. So take it away, Claudia.
So thanks to Elisa and Fatima for their help with the technology. And hi, everybody. I read all your greetings in the chat box, so thanks for logging in. Thanks again, and I'm for inviting me. For getting all us together tonight, because I was reminded this morning that today is Hug a Medievalist Day, so how appropriate that we get together tonight. And I'm thrilled to have the chance to share some of my work with you and talk about our project on source studies. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge someone who is unfortunately no longer with us. So his incredible work will live on and continue to contribute to our field, perhaps like no other. Of course, I'm thinking of Helmut Neuss. I was last in touch with Helmut Neuss in mid-January, in fact, just a few days before he was admitted to hospital. And he inquired about my work. As always, I was always curious to to hear about people's research. And I even mentioned this paper, and I promised a full report after tonight. Unfortunately, that's not going to be, and this paper will certainly not be up to his standards, not even remotely so, but I would like to take this opportunity to honor his memory and express my gratitude to him, because I can't possibly think of my work without Helmut Neuss. I mean, he features in all my references lists, and so thank you, Helmut, and we'll try and keep up the good work. So this paper is basically an oral presentation of an essay that it's hopefully going to be out this summer in an open access volume that I'm co-editing, and I'll make sure to share the link to the ebook with the ISSEME mailing list, as there are going to be quite a few contributions that I think might be interesting to you all. In particular, I'm thinking of some excellent essays by the like of Tom Hall and Lucia Castaldi. As you probably expect, this paper is going to be very much a source study thing. I'm sorry about that. And I will be touching on quite a few texts. And of course, during my talk, I won't be able to dwell on them as long as I should. That's why I've asked Thais and Elisa and Fatima to be so kind as to share a handout, which is a bit chunky, I must confess, but you can refer to it later and use on it later if you like. So it's meant, as a possible help to you. Anyway, to go through, the paper again if you sort of interested. So I've quite a long preamble, but I get started now, I promise. So despite the familiar characterization of Ælfric of Eynsham as a restrained author, equally cautious of doctrinal liberties and descriptive sensationalism, it didn't shy away from dramatic and visionary descriptions. One such graphic sketch is provided by the imagery of the swallowing devil, which occurs in at least 3 of his Catholic homilies. In both the homily for the 21st Sunday after Pentecost and one for St. Benedict's Day, the devil appears as a formidable dragon with jaws agape, ready to swallow a sinner. In the homily for Sunday of the first series, the devil is disguised as a fish snatching at the hook, the bait being represented by Christ himself. Notably, in all 3 homilies, the antecedent of the demonic devourer has ultimately been traced to the corpus of Gregory the Great, where the imagery of the devouring devil was often redeployed. And I will, in this paper, I will be talking especially about texts 1 to 4, which you'll find in your handout A, D. So this talk will try to clarify the relationship between Ælfric's homilies and their source texts, both ultimate and intermediate, as well as assessing Ælfric's distinctive contribution to what we may call the swallowing devil motif, a motif which, as I've argued elsewhere, was a veritable topos of early English demonology and eschatology. So let's start with the homily for the 21st Sunday after Pentecost. This homily is a commentary on the parable of the wedding banquet of the king's son, as narrated in Matthew 22:1-14. Ælfric explicitly declares that he is following Gregory's exposition of the Gospel lection, and indeed Gregory's homilia in Evangelia 38 has already been identified as Ælfric's major source text. And again, you can find a synoptic presentation of the dragon example in your handout B. In line with Gregory's exegesis, Ælfric interprets the parable of the wedding of the king's son as an allegory of Christ's marriage with the church, in which only a certain number partake, though virtually all are invited. Thus, the homily outlines a progressive series of exclusions from the ones who downright refuse the king's invitation and are therefore wiped out by the king's army, to the guest with no becoming outfit, that is charity, who is cast out into the night of eternal damnation. Hence the awful conclusion, the awful conclusion of the pericope, that is, many are called and few are chosen. a conclusion conveying the fine line between God's justice and mercy. While no one can take their own salvation for granted, neither should they despair of it, because God's mercy is bountiful. The popularity of Gregory's Homilia in Evangelia in early medieval England has already been demonstrated, especially by Tom Hall, who has done excellent work on this. Homilia 38 in particular is attested in all 5 complete or nearly complete witnesses of the Homilia in Evangelia circulating in England ante circa 1125. However, source study of the Catholic homilies has shown that, rather than consulting discrete texts of the individual patristic authorities he is so keen to acknowledge, Ælfric mostly drew on homiletic collections of continental origin, namely the homiliaries of Paul the Deacon, Hemo of Auxerre, and Smaragdus of Saint Michel. Indeed, the homily for the 21st Sunday after Pentecost suggests a combined use on Ælfric's part of 2 of his Carolingian sources, namely Paul the Deacon and Smaragdus. As to Paul the Deacon, Gregory's Homilia 38 did not feature in the original version of his homiliary, but it was added quite early on in an augmented version. And this version demonstrably circulated in England by the beginning of the 12th century. Ælfric most likely drew on Gregory's Homilia 38 from such an augmented version of Paul the Deacon's homiliary, though of course he can't have consulted any of the witnesses you see listed here, as they all postdate him. Now, in all these manuscripts, Gregory's Homilia 38 is rubricated for the 20th rather than the 21st Sunday after Pentecost. On the other hand, Smaragdus' Gospel homily for the 21st Sunday after Pentecost shares the same lection as Gregory's Homilia 38, namely Matthew 22, 1:14, and draws on it. Smaragdus' debt to the Gregorian source, however, is selective and definitely less extensive than Ælfric's. And what is more, Smaragdus does not include the final exemplum on the devouring dragon in his selection. Therefore, while drawing on Gregory's homily from his altered copy of Paul the Deacon's homily, Ælfric may well have followed Smaragdus in using it for the 21st Sunday after Pentecost. The protagonist of the dragon exemplum is the depraved brother of a pious monk, who is suddenly hit by plague, though in Ælfric's vernacular version, the illness befalling him is left unspecified. Despite having made himself burdensome to the community, the brethren piously gather around his deathbed to pray for his soul and ease his passing, when he suddenly cries out to them to step away because a dragon is about to kill him, but is hindered by their presence. Therefore, the dying man urges the brethren to leave, so that the dragon may no longer afflict him. The dragon, however, remains invisible to the bewildered brethren, encourage the dying to dispel the evil apparition by marking himself with the sign of the cross. But the sick man protests that he can't bless himself because the dragon oppresses him. Thus, brethren prostrate themselves onto the floor and start praying more fervently for the salvation of the dying. Thereby, they ultimately succeed in putting the dragon to flight. And indeed, their intercession also grants the sick man a temporary recovery and sparks his repentance and conversion, as he declares himself ready to give up his worldly conduct and embrace the monastic life, turning to God with his heart. Reformed and redeemed by the physical suffering caused by his illness, he finally dies shortly afterwards, without facing any dragon this time, because he defeated it by means of his conversion. Now, Ælfric's rendition of the Latin antecedent can on the whole be said to be faithful, or even at times, but also selective, with Ælfric bypassing many circumstantial details and focusing instead on the very climax of the narrative, his encounter with the dragon. This crucial meeting is read very closely, with no significant omission. In fact, Ælfric slightly expands his source text to the effect of emphasizing the distress of the dying man and torment inflicted by the dragon, which oppresses him so gravely that he can't even make the sign of the cross, although he would gladly do so. Now, The major discrepancy between Ælfric's version and Gregory's source text, however, consists of a difference in the age assigned to the protagonist. Throughout the Latin exemplum, the age of the dying man is never specified. It can be assumed to be an adult, and towards the conclusion of Homilia 38, he is indeed defined as a man, homo in Latin. Conversely, the Old English describes the monk as se adliac nicht, the sick boy or the sick young man, whereas the corresponding Latin reading is amelioratus eger, so the improved sick man. Pretty much the same exemplum as Homilia 38 occurs earlier on in Gregory's collection, that is Homilia 19 in Evangelia. The Gospel lection for Homilia 19 is the parable of the workers in the vineyard, that's Matthew 21:16, which makes a similar point as the parable of the wedding feast, and what is more, features the very same conclusion, namely, many are called, but few are chosen. Thus, here too, the story of the wicked man snatched from the jaws of the terrible dragon on his deathbed by the monk's intercession and eventually repenting and converting after a life of sin and misconduct provides a fitting epilogue to the explication of the pericope. Compared with its counterpart in Homilia 38, the exemplum in Homilia 19 is somewhat differently structured and can be said to be slightly lengthier and rhetorically more elaborated. In turn, there are some differences between the two recensions in which Homilia 19 is attested, and these are recension alpha, which is earlier and say unauthorized, and later and definitive recension beta. Recension alpha in particular indulges in graphic anatomic details of the dragon's attack and his suffocating grip on the sick man that prevents him from making the sign of the cross. Conversely, recension beta doesn't mention the dragon's scales, but keeps the vivid detail of the dragon's drooling on the man's face and runs up the scene with the dragon swallowing of the man's head. In Homilia 38, no mention is made of either the dragon's scales or saliva. So to cut a long story short, it can be said that the exemplum in Homilia 38 is a plainer narrative than the one in Homilia 19, in particular the alpha text of Homilia 19. So we can envisage Gregory rewriting the exemplum in Homilia 38, but keeping to the beta version of Homilia 19, that is maintaining the changes and revisions he made when he amended the unauthorized alpha version. As to the key detail of the age of the sick person, throughout Homilia 19, it is left unspecified, and both the reading Melioratus Eger of Homilia 38 or Ælfric's reading Se adliac nicht are unparalleled, so the sick person could be assumed to be an adult. But in the lengthy concluding passage of both recensions of Homilia 19, a passage which is unparalleled in all the other Gregorian versions under consideration, the dying man is referred to as Juvenis Pravus, adult youngster. Now let's have a look to the dialogi then. The dialogi version of the exemplum is the shortest of the four and is explicitly presented as derivative of some unspecified homilies that had been delivered in public, so in homilies coram populo iam narrassem memini. The dialogue exemplum on the whole doesn't correspond closely with any of the three versions of the exemplum from the Homilia in Evangelia, that is Homilia 19 alpha, 19 beta, and 38. The apparently bewildering distribution of both overlaps and discrepancies has been put down to the fact that the dialogue tale may have been pieced together by a later compiler, who, having access to both recensions of the Homilia in Evangelia, mostly followed Homilia 38, but incorporated at least two details from the alpha text of Homilia 19, namely the loud cries of the dying brother and the scales of the dragon, to confer greater graphic quality to their narrative. What is most relevant in light of Ælfric's rendition, however, is the incipit of the dialogue tale. The syncipit is totally idiosyncratic and features some details concerning the protagonist, which are unparalleled in the Homilie. In that, the dying person is presented as a restless youth named Theodore, although at the end, in a passage overlapping with Homilia 38, he is referred to as a homo. Now, the Old English version of the Dialogi repeatedly identifies the dying man as a knecht. Godden has concluded that Ælfric's reading Se abject nicht, presumably, I quote, recalls the Old English Dialogi, unless Ælfric had a copy of Homilia 38 in which the detail had been added. In fact, the matter is further complicated by the reading Juvenis Pravus of Homilia 19, which Malcolm Galton doesn't consider. Let's say that given the complexities of the relative dating and textual vicissitudes of the Homilien Evangelia on the one hand and of the Dialogi on the other, the two most sensible options are that Ælfric's reading Se abject nicht may be traced to either a version of Homilia 38, which featured a putative puer reading instead of melioratus eger, or a mnemonic recollection of the Dialogi, whether in Latin or Old English. As to the hypothesis of a puer reading, the reading featured in the extant witnesses of Homilia 38, which were either circulating or written in early medieval England that I've been able to consult, is fundamentally identical to melioratus eger. As to the hypothesis of a mnemonic recollection of the Dialogi, the role of spontaneous memorial quotation has been positively advocated in the composition and transmission of Old English anonymous homilies, while Ælfric's scholars have been more tentative when it comes to Ælfric. But significantly, Joyce Hill has argued that whereas the tradition within which Ælfric was working was firmly text-based and, say, authority-aware, the effects of memory in contributing to the weaving and interweaving of texts certainly cannot be excluded. Be as it may, on the Old English front, on the Latin front, on the very Gregorian front, memory must have played a role, apparently, because Gregory himself, or whoever was responsible for the Dialogi version of the Exemplum, explicitly evokes the role of memory by stating that the Dialogi tale recalls some unspecified homilies. Remember, in homilies coram populo iam narrasse mememini. And incidentally, the plural form of homilia can be taken as a revealing, albeit scanty, acknowledgement of the plurality of versions of the Exemplum within the Gregorian corpus. And indeed, a similar Exemplum occurs shortly later on in the Dialogi, always the fourth book of the Dialogi, the most problematic one, by the way, in terms of authorship. In this Exemplum, however, the dragon winds its tail around sinful monk's knees and feet and presses its head into the monk's mouth to draw out its breath of life, in a sort of reversal of the swallowing scene described in the previous tales. Interestingly, this Exemplum has been likened to a narrative in the Adhortationes Sanctorum Patrum, one of the many collections of exempla making up the Vitas Patrum. In fact, the Vitas Patrum tale doesn't admittedly mention any dragon, but a merciless dark devil instead. The Latin Exemplum proved very popular, as it was known in medieval Ireland, in Scandinavia, and early medieval England. And in England, the Latin text is attested in the final section of manuscript Worcester F48. And what is more, it was translated into Old English by Ælfric for some unknown occasion in the supplementary homily. Thereby conferring Ælfric's receptiveness to such post-mortem tableaux and their gripping sensationalistic potential. So I'll move to the second homily I would like to discuss now, and that's the homily for St. Benedict's Day in the second series. Now, here, the second book of the Dialogue is fundamentally Ælfric's only source for this hagiographic homily, a source which Ælfric drastically summarizes, reshaping Gregory's account into, I quote, a context-free narrative of sanctity, exemplifying divine power, working through Benedict in miracles of healing, prophecy, and the fate of the devil. The exemplar in question features indeed the devil in its most archetypal guise, the dragon. But here, the latter plays not so much the saint's antagonist as is ally, instrumental in recovering a stray sheep. As we learn from the final pun, the dragon is a hallucination conjured up by St. Benedict himself to scare off a restless monk eager to leave the monastery. Sure enough, as soon as he exits the monastery, he is confronted by a dragon moving menacingly towards him with jaws agape. Terrified, he cries out for help, and his brethren promptly run to his rescue, carrying him back to the monastery, which he solemnly promises never to leave again. Ælfric's rendition of the tale is a straightforward retelling, independent from the corresponding passage of the Old English dialogues, and you can find both the Latin and Old English versions on your handout. While the Old English dialogues closely keep to the Latin-based text, occasionally expanding it by means of doublets, Ælfric, in line with the concisions consistently displays throughout his homily, abridges the description of the preliminary exchanges between the rebellious monk and the admonishing and exasperated Benedict, but retains all the events that followed the monk's departure from the monastery. So that's pretty straightforward, I would say. Move on to the third Ælfrician homily now. That's the In Homilia Palmarum of the first series of the Catholic homilies. Here, the Gregorian imagery of the greedy satanic snake is employed in a dense exegetical passage, where Ælfric tackles crucial theological questions, such as the coexistence of divinity and humanity in Christ, the hypostasis, and the divine plan for universal redemption through his death on the cross. The key theme of the homily is Christ's entry into Jerusalem, of which Ælfric provides, I quote, a fairly complex exposition by drawing on the accounts of all four Gospels and on different patristic elucidations of the evangelical narratives, as well as working at different levels of interpretation. In particular, the reading of the event as an allegory of mankind's redemption triggers a general discussion of the divine scheme for universal salvation, culminating in the graphic image of Satan as the greedy fish who is fooled by Christ's suffering body on the cross and tries to snatch him, but is fatally pierced by the hook of Christ's divine nature. First attested in the corpus of the Greek father Gregory of Nyssa, the bait and hook imagery was introduced to the West by Rufinus of Aquileia, who was also responsible for translating many of the Vitas Patrum exemplar, by the way, and it was eventually popularized by Gregory the Great as an effective metaphor to illustrate the ultimate conflict between God and the devil, and for the salvation of humankind. Excuse me. Indeed, Ælfric's take on this imagery is most likely indebted, though not verbatim, to Gregory's Homilia in Evangelia 25 for Easter Sunday. In particular, Gregory envisions Satan as a greedy fish and Christ as both the bait in his human body and the hook in his divine nature. Satan is misled by Christ's human flesh veiling his divine nature and immortal nature, like a bait on a fishhook, and greedily attempts to swallow Jesus dying on the cross, but gets trapped and ultimately vanquished. Thereby, Christ's apparent humiliation and suffering on the cross turns into his definitive triumph over Satan and death. And indeed, all mankind shares in Christ's victory, since by sacrificing himself on the cross, Christ has rescued humanity from Satan and death, or has ransomed humanity from Satan's death, as the ransom theory goes. The relevant section from Ælfric's Palm Sunday homily doesn't seem to rely closely on any of the sources which have so far been identified, and can instead be considered a pretty drastic precis of the Gregorian argument as laid out in both Homilia 25 and the Moralia. In particular, I would suggest that the Beit and Hook passage in Ælfric's Palm Sunday homily is a memorial recollection of the extensive Gregorian treatment of the theme, a recollection perhaps triggered by Smaragdus, though. In Smaragdus' Homiliary, Christ's entry in Jerusalem, that is the pericope of the Palm Sunday homily of the first series, is expounded in an Advent homily, that's the first Sunday in Advent. And in particular, Smaragdus' pericope is Matthew 21:1-9, whereas, as I've mentioned before, Ælfric sort of conflates the accounts of all Gospels. Anyway, because of the overlap, say, in the pericopes, Smaragdus' Advent homily has been included among the sources, or the possible sources, of Ælfric's Palm Sunday homily of the first series. But in fact, I would suggest that we should rather look to two other homilies by Smaragdus. That is, the Gospel and Epistle homilies for the Palm Sunday, that is, for the very same liturgical occasion as Ælfric's homily. So Smaragdus' homiliary includes two homilies for Palm Sunday, an Epistle homily and a Gospel homily. The Epistle homily expounds the famous Christological poem embedded within Paul's Epistle ad Philippenses, whereas the Gospel homily is an exposition of John's account of the Last Supper. Both the Epistle and the Gospel pericopes deal with Christ's double nature, and the Pauline Epistle in particular focuses on Christ's self-sacrifice on the cross as an act of universal redemption. Although neither homily features the Beit and Hook metaphor itself, the topic of both largely overlaps with Ælfric's argument. Thus, the Beit and Hook section of the Palm Sunday homily of the first series may be taken as a climactic close to the narrative of Christ's entry into Jerusalem, possibly recalled from memory by a spontaneous association with Smaragdus' homilies for the same liturgical occasion, Palm Sunday. Indeed, it should be stressed that neither of the two Smaragdus' homilies for Palm Sunday draws on Gregory. The Epistle homily is a brief catena of passages from Augustine and John Chrysostom, whereas the much longer Gospel homily consists of extracts from St. Augustine's in Johannes Evangelium Tractatus 124. This exegetical treatise by Augustine was a major source of Smaragdus for his Johannine homilies, though mostly via Alcuin's Commentaria in Sancti Johannes Evangelium. Alcuin's commentary can be considered sort of as an epitome of Augustine's tractates. So, notably, Augustine's Tractatus count among the ultimate sources of Ælfric's other Palm Sunday homily, that is the Palm Sunday homily for the second series of the Catholic homilies. This homily, the Palm Sunday homily of the second series, is a long narrative piece on Christ's passion, drawing on all four Gospels and supplemented with some points of interpretation, including a brief but significant one about the humanity of Christ and his suffering on the cross. According to previous scholarship, this interpretative passage may have been inspired by Augustine's Tractatus or be put down to Ælfric's personal touch. Indeed, Godden has noted that the combination of the evangelical narratives in the Palm Sunday homily of the second series is somewhat unusual for Ælfric, and that Ælfric probably worked as much from memory and his strained understanding of the gospel narratives as from direct sources. Now, it is noteworthy that the Smaragdus piece, which is among the immediate sources of the Palm Sunday homily of the second series, is not so much a homily as a lengthy account of Christ's passion based on the three synoptic gospels and integrated with exegetical commentary. So pretty much like Ælfric's text itself, with which it also shares an almost identical title. Indeed, the very position of the Smaragdus piece within his homiliary is somehow noteworthy, in that it occurs after the two homilies for the fifth Sunday and before the two Palm Sunday homilies, that is, the very Palm Sunday homilies, which I have suggested, may have inspired Ælfric's discussion of the bait and hook metaphor in his Palm Sunday homily of the first series. In sum, both Palm Sunday items in the two series of the Catholic homilies seem to be somehow indebted to Smaragdus and Hilary, although such a debt cannot be forthrightly defined in terms of source text. The relationship between Ælfric's homilies and Smaragdus's ones should rather be assessed in the light of the dense and multi-layered intertextual tradition in which Ælfric consciously positioned himself, as well as in the light of the methods of composition typical of a literary culture in which ingrained biblical and patristic reading, doctrinal instruction, and liturgical practice coexisted. On the one hand, the extensive discussion of Christ's double nature and the soteriology of the cross in the Palm Sunday homily of the first series may have been inspired by Smaragdus's epistle and gospel homilies for Palm Sunday, and ultimately crowned with the iconic bait and hook imagery of Gregorian brand, although the latter was not included in any of Ælfric's Carolingian intermediate sources. On the other, the Palm Sunday homily of the second series is structured as a gospel-based account of Christ's passion, not unlike Smaragdus's own Passio Domini Jesu Christi. I'll move on to my conclusions, I promise. So, contrary to the restraint with which he has traditionally been characterized, Ælfric penned quite a few graphic and sensational visionary and eschatological scenes. Indeed, as I hope to have shown, Ælfric also included in his homilies some pretty haunting example of the demonic devourer, thereby sharing in what may be called the early English penchant for this imagery. Without indulging in the received dichotomy between the anonymous homilists and hagiographers with their apocryphal slant and doctrinal liberties on the one hand, and the rigorous patristic-based and reform-aligned Ælfric on the other, it should be pointed out that in all the case studies examined in this paper, Ælfric does indeed derive his take on the swallowing devilish monster from a most commanding patristic authority, and that's Gregory the Great. However, the ultimate patristic source has been mediated by Carolingian transmitters, as well as being aptly elaborated on and integrated with echoes of ingrained biblical reading, exegetical learning, liturgical drill, and familiar tales of monastic literature. In this regard, the exemplar discussed may contribute interesting insights into Ælfric's methods of composition and into the densely layered intertextual tradition in which Ælfric actively participated and with which is subtly engaged. Thanks for listening. Thank you.